I'd like to welcome you all here to the Work of Settler Colonialism Symposium. My name is Anne Spice. I am a PhD student in anthropology here at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I also want to introduce my co-organizers, Andrew Bard-Epstein and Antonia Grichu-Woodsum. Yeah, we should give them a round of applause, actually. And I'm so excited to welcome you all here today. I think this is going to be a really exciting day of panels and discussion and conversation. And I want to start, I have three big acknowledgements that are important to get out of the way before we get started. The first is that I'd like to acknowledge the Lenni Lenape and other Algonquian-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory, Mannahatta, and the larger area of Lenape-Hoking that we live in and work in and learn in. So a little bit more background on this particular territory, especially for those of you who are coming in from other places. And if you have come for a long way, I also want to extend a special welcome to those folks. In the 17th century, both the Dutch and English settled and colonized the lands that would become New York City. And as a result of this settlement, and also the Indian Removal Act under President Jackson, many Lenape people were dispossessed to lands as far west as present-day Oklahoma. This island itself has been materially and ecologically and socially transformed through the building of this city, but the presence of this city does not erase the long history of Indigenous peoples on these lands, and I think that's going to become very clear as we go through the work of today. In line with our symposium theme on work and labor, we also want to acknowledge the Indigenous labor that has helped to build the infrastructure of New York City. From the early 20th century, Mohawk steelworkers traveled between their homeland territories and the city to construct bridges and skyscrapers, including the Empire State Building right outside our doors, the UN General Assembly Building, the Metropolitan Life Tower, the RCA Building, and more. These ironworkers, mostly from Kahnawake, belonged to both the Manhattan and Brooklyn locals of the International Association of Bridge, Structural, and Ornamental Ironworkers. So we see already the links between settler colonialism, Indigenous labor, and work in this city. Today also we want to acknowledge that this is not just a historical presence, but New York City itself is home to over 100,000 Native people, more than any other urban center in the United States. And so this work that happens to erase Indigenous presence is something that we want to push back hard against. So that's the first acknowledgement. The second is we wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the work of Patrick Wolfe, who passed away unexpectedly in February. Patrick Wolfe's scholarship and activism have profoundly influenced our work, the organizers, and I think a lot of people in this room. And in particular, his articulation of the logics of elimination that continue to produce the structures of settler colonialism has, for many of us, shaped our thinking about the contemporary nature of that form of oppression. And for me, his work has been particularly helpful in contesting readings of colonial violence that would place oppression in the past and not the present. So Patrick Wolfe's work has had considerable impacts on Native studies and settler colonial studies and anthropology, and we really hope that it will continue to be read and cited and engaged, and we're going to do some of that today. So we want to acknowledge him as well as we enter this conversation. Thirdly, I'd like to welcome you to CUNY and to the Graduate Center, where the topic of labor, and especially student labor, is at the top of our minds right now. And so I want to acknowledge all the forms of labor that went into the creation of this symposium, and to remind you to acknowledge and thank all of the staff and other people who are here to help us make this happen today. And also the graduate workers who work in this building on other CUNY campuses around the city, who are fighting now for better pay and better teaching conditions in the CUNY system. And I want to give you a really brief synopsis of where we're at with that particular fight. And a shout out to the Adjunct Project and Sean Kennedy for helping me sort of put together this synopsis. So since the beginning of this academic year, there's been talk of a strike as the only way to ensure a fair contract with CUNY management, which the Professional Staff Congress, or the PSC, has been steadily bargaining with since June 2014. And this is after an initial session in January of 2011. So 6 years have passed since the last contract expired. We've been working without a contract for 6 years. And management, having made a measly contract offer that would essentially amount to a pay cut for faculty and staff, has declared an impasse. So the possibility of a strike vote first became tangible when the PSC announced in October that it would hold a strike authorization vote that, if successful, would allow the PSC's executive council to call a strike. Subsequently, the PSC has been asking its members to publicly declare their intention to vote yes on that strike authorization vote when it occurs, and in response, there's been a large amount of additional organizing. So despite management's notice of impasse, preparations for strike authorization vote are continuing, and if management has basically given up on bargaining, as the notice of impasse indicates, holding a strike seems crucial. In this context, a strike is the only way to ensure a fair contract, and it's essential to ensuring also adjunct needs and student needs need to be sufficiently met in the contract, and further to mobilizing a broad-based transformation of CUNY. So as we talk through the intersections of work and settler colonialism today, I'd like us to keep in mind that these are not abstract or theoretical struggles. They're happening here, they're happening on this campus, when we mobilize around our own labor and our own teaching, where we contest tuition increases and attacks on our students, and where we continue to operate on land that was stolen and operate alongside relations of capital that continue to contain Indigenous lives and futures. So I hope we'll keep these really sort of real, tangible effects and intersections in mind as we enter this conversation. So our first panel, which is really sort of setting the tone for the day, some sort of theoretical tensions, and bringing out some of the concepts that we want to keep exploring through the rest of the day. So I'll just introduce each of them, and then we'll let them do their work, and we'll have some time for conversation and questions and answers afterwards. Get on the right page here. Oh, I should also point out the hashtag. We've decided that it's not rude if you're tweeting. So if you're on your phone, we're going to assume that you're tweeting, and we'll look for your tweets. Okay, so the first panel, our first panelist is Sean Kennedy. The title of his paper is Right to Work, Labor, Political Economy, and U.S. Settler Misrecognition. Sean is a former journalist and a PhD student in English at the Graduate Center at CUNY here. He's working on questions of global political economy, decolonization, and cultural and media form. Sean holds an MFA in creative writing from Rutgers University, Newark, a BA in English and Modern Studies from the University of Virginia, and teaches at CUNY's Medgar Evers College. His dissertation is an interdisciplinary study of global gangster culture and colonial post-colonial political economy, governance, and social relations, with a particular focus on Mumbai, Johannesburg, and New York City. In 2014, he won the Diana Colbert Award for Innovative Teaching from the Grad Center's PhD program in English, and since 2013, he's been the coordinator of advocacy and education for the CUNY Adjunct Project, which, like I said, is doing really important work right now to make sure adjuncts' needs are met in that contract negotiation. Our second speaker will be Tamar Blickstein, who the title of her paper is Keeping the Colony Pure one. Is that the right one? Maybe she'll just give us the title when she comes up. Okay. She's a PhD candidate in anthropology at Columbia University. Her dissertation is an ethnography of the racial and spatial logics governing Argentine settler nationhood on native Quam lands. Her comparative approach builds on an MA thesis in France on colonial blind spots across several national cases and is informed by South American perspectives on settler colonialism. The third speaker will be Sam Markwell. His paper is Subsumption and the Colonial Relation in Capital and U.S. Law. Sam is a second-year PhD student in the American Studies program at New York University. His work is situated in the fields of history, anthropology, geography, Native studies, settler colonial studies, and critical race studies. His research investigates the array of concepts and apparatuses of security that animate U.S. and Israeli settler colonial projects, specifically focusing on contestations over food and water infrastructures in Native American and Palestinian homelands. And our last speaker on this panel is Dana Francisco Miranda. The title of his paper is Wretched Spaces, Manichean Divisions in the Arendtian Republic. Dana is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. His research is in Africana philosophy, political geography, indigeneity, as well as colonialism and diaspora studies. His current work investigates geopolitics in relation to the revolutionary politics, spatial division, and public violence. So please join me in welcoming our first panel.
Thank you, Anne, for all those important acknowledgements, and for your work, and Nina's work, and Andrew's work in putting together this incredible gathering today. I mean, having organized conferences of my own, I know how much work goes into this, and I want to truly thank you. And thank you all for coming today. I also just want to give one other shout out, which is that in addition to the strike organizing that's happening here at the Graduate Center and across CUNY, the Doctoral Students' Council will be taking up a resolution endorsing the boycott of Israeli academic institutions in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. And we just released the boycott resolution text along with an FAQ last night on our new website, cunyboycott.wordpress.com, which you can check out. And we would appreciate all the support that you could give us given the various Zionist pushbacks that we've been facing here over the last couple of weeks and the last couple of years. So thank you for that applause. That means a lot to all of us who are organizing on this issue. I'm just going to start. What the hell were they talking about? Fate asked Chuchu Flores as they were eating breakfast at a bar near the Arena del Norte. About the women who've been killed, said Chuchu Flores glumly. The numbers are up, he said. Every so often, the numbers go up and it's news again, and the reporters talk about it. People talk about it too, and the story grows like a snowball until the sun comes out and the whole damn ball melts and everybody forgets about it and goes back to work. They go back to work? Asked Fate. The fucking killings are like a strike, amigo, a brutal fucking strike. The comparison of the killings to a strike was odd, but Fate nodded his head and didn't say anything. In this passage from Roberto Bolaño's novel 2666, a black U.S. sports writer, intriguingly named Fate, on assignment in Mexico to cover a boxing match, is keyed into a regular topic of conversation in Santa Teresa, the novel's version of Ciudad Juarez, the epidemic of the murder of women or femicide in the aftermath of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994. As Bolaño makes clear in the novel, the women affected by this epidemic are largely indigenous and largely employed by the maquiladoras or sweatshops that sprung up as U.S. companies took advantage of NAFTA to lower their labor costs by outsourcing production. At the same time, of course, narco-capitalists took advantage of the liberalized economy and the law to grow their own companies, otherwise known as cartels. I use the word epidemic here consciously to invoke the durable legacy of conquest and its multifarious violences that continue to affect indigenous communities in the 3 settler states of North America, even as indigenous labor becomes more necessary for global capitalism, joining indigenous land as a complementary resource to be exploited. Meanwhile, the legacy of enslavement, co-constituted and intertwined with that of conquest, continues to inflict its own multiple violences, even as black labor becomes arguably less necessary for global capitalism, as both the global prison industrial complex expands and global capital starts to flee sub-Saharan African economies, as a glance at the Wall Street Journal any day shows. And yet, if native dispossession and black labor in the form of chattel slavery are the foundations of capitalism, as indigenous studies and black studies respectively teach us, then what is the role of indigenous labor now, and now that the importance of black labor is arguably declining? On this question, I want to turn to both A, settler recognition and misrecognition of Indigenous labor in the context of unionization and right-to-work initiatives that would outlaw union activity or severely restrict it at native casinos in the U.S., and B, the transformative possibilities of the strike, and particularly, sorry, this is the one problem when you're reading off a screen like this. Sometimes you miss your lines. And particularly a general strike following the analysis of Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism in relation to Glenn Coulthard's red Marxism, as I like to think of it, in red-skinned white masks. Together, Robinson's and Coulthard's interventions highlight the misrecognition of the role of the proletariat over that of land-based communities and revolutionary struggle by analysts who don't take up an Indigenous lens. In the first instance, settler recognition and what I also want to call misrecognition of Indigenous labor, I would like to briefly invoke recent maneuvers by both the U.S. state and U.S. labor unions to recognize native casino workers under U.S. labor law, even as such recognition is simultaneously a misrecognition of native labor as capitalist labor, rather than as part of the, quote, grounded normativity Coulthard puts forward in red-skinned white masks. On the one hand, in keeping with the so-called right-to-work policy movement that has reduced the ability of unions to operate and workers to unionize in the the U.S. Congress is in the process of considering legislation that would prevent casino workers from being recognized under the National Labor Relations Act, which, if passed, would mean such workers couldn't unionize. But the question of recognition here is double-edged. The congressional members pushing this legislation are exploiting notions of tribal sovereignty to assert that such sovereignty, already recognized by the U.S. state, prohibits the U.S. state from further recognition, even while this maneuver already presumes that casino workers are workers, just not workers that should be allowed to unionize. On the other hand, big labor, in keeping with its search for new sectors of workers to organize to make up for their losses under this decades-long shift to right to work and away from unionization generally in the U.S., argue that casino workers are workers who deserve the right to unionize. As AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka puts it, quote, "We believe in both tribal sovereignty and worker solidarity. We don't have to choose," end quote. And yet, if one is to take not just tribal sovereignty, but Indigenous epistemology and cosmology seriously, one has to make a choice. The wage labor Trumka and other union leaders broker is a severe contradiction of the grounded normativity Coulthard describes. Quote, "The modalities of Indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time," end quote. Indeed, the very recognition of Indigenous labor as wage labor can only occur as a function of the historical and ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples. This leads to the second issue I want to address, the centrality of the proletariat, that is the industrial working class or wage laborers broadly, in what I want to call settler Marxist theory of class struggle and revolution. Further, by critically examining the role of the proletariat in settler Marxism, I believe we can move beyond the narrow confines of a labor strike to the transformative possibilities of a general strike against the settler state. On this point, Cedric Robinson's analysis of W.E.B. Du Bois's understanding of the general strike that, quote, "turned loose the revolutionary dynamics of the Civil War," end quote, is instructive. As Robinson writes in Black Marxism, quote, 100,000 poor whites had deserted the Confederate armies and perhaps 500,000 black workers had abandoned the plantations, end quote, adding that, quote, "it was the same pattern that would come to fruition in Russia. Like the American slaves and the poor whites, in the midst of the war, the Russian peasantry would desert their armies in the field. The rebellion, too, marked the beginnings of revolution," end quote. These socio-labor dynamics, Robinson writes, also adhered in other revolutionary moments, the, quote, Indian Mutiny, the Boxer Rebellion, the nationalist struggles in the Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, Somalia, Abyssinia, West and Southern Africa, and the People's Wars of Mexico and China. In every instance, he writes, peasants and agrarian workers had been the primary social bases of rebellion. Nowhere, not even in Russia, where rebellious urban proletariat was a fraction of the mobilized working classes, had a bourgeois social order formed a precondition for revolutionary struggle, end quote. In other words, the emphasis in settler Marxism on proletarian consciousness as the linchpin in not just class struggle but revolution is misplaced. Instead, Robinson argues, the fulcrum of revolution historically has been land-based communities. Further, Robinson highlights what seems to be a gap in indigenous studies of North America, that the enslaved people of the Americas, captured in and transported from Africa, were first and foremost indigenous peoples. Quote, Marx had meant by primitive accumulation that the piezas de Indias had been produced materially and intellectually by the societies from which they were taken and not by those by which they were exploited. However, Marx had not fully realized that the cargoes of laborers also contained African cultures, critical mixes and admixtures of language and thought, of cosmology and metaphysics, of habits, beliefs, and morality. African labor brought the past with it. This was the embryo of the demon that would be visited on the whole enterprise of primitive accumulation, end quote. Indeed, not only does the invocation of piezas de Indias here link up specifically with the Spanish settler colonial legacy that centrally informs Bolaño's novel 2666, but Robinson's focus on the contradiction of indigeneity to settler colonialism also resonates with the violence of a strike that the Bolaño character expresses. The fucking killings are like a strike, amigo, a brutal fucking strike, only with the violence turned against the settler state rather than deployed by it. Coulthard, too, critiques Marx's notion of primitive accumulation, but does so from the point of dispossession rather than labor. And, perhaps matching the gap I previously observed in indigenous studies, the matter of dispossession seems to be a gap in Black studies, particularly in the context of diaspora. Nevertheless, Coulthard makes the case, similarly to Robinson, albeit in the Canadian context, that proletarianization, quote, has not been the dominant background structure shaping the historical relationship between indigenous peoples and the state, end quote. Instead, quote, the theory and practice of indigenous anti-colonialism, including indigenous anti-capitalism, is best understood as a struggle primarily inspired by and oriented around the question of land, a struggle not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what the land as system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms, and less around our emergent status as rightless proletarians, end quote. To sum up, although Coulthard and Robinson come from two different intellectual traditions and two different, if related, positions within the work that settler colonialism does, they both reject the settler state's recognized forms of labor, a recognition that is always already a misrecognition. In this way, by linking Black Marxism with red Marxism, and taking land as a point of departure for revolutionary struggle rather than wage labor, I believe we might overcome not just settler capitalism, but settler colonialism too. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to the organizers for making this happen. My paper is titled Indians from Elsewhere on the Logic of Native Estrangement in Argentina. I've changed it from what's on the program. By what alchemy do natives become strangers in a settler colonial society? In this paper, I discuss the paradoxical tendency in Argentina for immigrant colonists and their descendants to describe their native neighbors and laborers as though they were migrants from elsewhere. This is a process I will call the settler logic of native estrangement. By the logic of native estrangement, I refer to the settler attempt to turn natives into foreign interlopers from elsewhere, making them into strangers on their own lands. It is a twist on the term we owe to Patrick Wolfe, who argued that settler colonialism is defined by its logic of native elimination. That is, the settler drive to eliminate and replace natives on the land rather than exploiting their labor. Adapting Wolfe's framework to my case, I'll argue that estrangement is a kind of elimination, but one that leaves plenty of room for a settler society to exploit indigenous laboring bodies. In a first part of the paper, I'll provide an overview of the Argentine context of native estrangement, while in a second and third parts, I'll turn to some ethnographic examples from my fieldwork in the settler frontier zone of Argentina called Chaco, where settler cotton planters who have long employed native labor routinely disavow native presence. I'll make three key arguments. One, that this tendency to turn natives into foreign intruders has been structurally embedded in Argentine nation-state formation and forms the bedrock of Argentine race politics to this day. Two, that this tendency to portray natives as foreigners is part of the ongoing day-to-day work of settler society to negotiate and sustain a sense of national territorial belonging when faced with the threat of a persistent native politics. Three, that this tendency is not just discursive, but has authorized concrete policies of expulsion on the ground that have been extremely deleterious for native peoples. One, context. As a settler society of the global south in Latin America, Argentina is not usually considered in the settler colonial studies literature. I can get into this later in Q&A, but it's partly due to Spanish colonial legacies of native labor exploitation and traditions of mestizaje, as well as other factors I don't have time to elaborate here. Nevertheless, Argentina has a lot in common with other settler societies of the so-called New World that were ideologically forged as European melting pots and where national imaginaries project natives as vanished. I argue that this narrative of an Indian free land was achieved from the start by turning natives into foreign intruders, notably the formative nation-building war of the 19th century, called the Conquest of the Desert Campaign, sought to exterminate the Mapuche, who have always lived on both sides of the present-day Chilean border, on the grounds that they were foreign Indian invaders from Chile. Instead of targeting them racially as savages, morally as sinners, or even as internal enemies of the state, the liberal language of just war specifically structured them as intruders from elsewhere. A race discourse of native intrusion has since recurred across distinct instances in Argentina, when policies of the famous populist president Juan Perón brought throngs of dark-skinned mestizos of native descent into the white European city centers during the 1950s. These internal migrants were racialized as cabecitas negras, or little blackheads, a term that recurs in national imaginaries and vocabularies to this day. Native people pushed to the country's borders are consistently denied land claims today on the basis that their claimants' ancestors were invaders or immigrants from Chile, Bolivia, or Paraguay. On the flip side, today's immigrants, who are overwhelmingly of Andean descent, are racialized as indios, while many of my indigenous interlocutors from Chaco, which is in the north of the country, had been victims of a paradoxical xenophobia when visiting or working in the capital. So to sum up my argument in this section, I'm suggesting that this racial and spatial logic of native estrangement is critical to understanding how Argentina continues to forge itself as a pure settler society of Europeans on virgin soil, despite the fact that its extractive and tropical industries have always relied on native labor, that mestizos form the majority of the population, and that native demographics and politics are increasingly visible. 2. This mechanism becomes much more salient when seen from the cotton planting region of Chaco province, where I conducted my fieldwork. Wherever I'd go in the cotton belt, people would repeat the national story. Here there was nothing. This land was an empty desert when the immigrants came. The immigrants made Argentina. The immigrants built Chaco, etc. Now, if Chaco weren't one of the most heavily indigenous corners of the country, the persistence of this narrative would be less perplexing, but that's hardly the case. Chaco is part of more than 50% of current Argentine territory that had been ruled by militarily autonomous natives before settler state incursions through the early 20th century. Because prior to this, they'd been treated as naciones, nations, by the Spanish, who repeatedly failed to conquer them and who termed this area el impenetrable, the impenetrable. And although natives in the subtropical regions like Chaco were violently cleared from the land in these campaigns, they were rounded up in labor reserves to furnish the cheap or indentured work supply that these industries needed. In fact, all the descendants of European immigrant cotton planters I spoke to had employed native labor at some point or another. Moreover, native politics in Chaco are increasingly visible and vocal in both their own media and settler media representations across the country. In both their own and settler media, I want to say. So this is not an invisible demographic by any means, nor a silent one. Natives in Chaco are some of the most historically, demographically, and politically visible natives in the country. So it seems like a contradiction. On one hand, my settler informants were structurally tropical plantation colonists dependent on native labor, aware of local native demographics, and even fearful of rising native politics. And on the other, they strongly identified, talked, and behaved as members of what economic historians have called a pure settler colony. My research found one explanation for this in the logic of native estrangement that was at work among my settler informants. Almost anywhere I lived or traveled in the Cotton Belt where stories of settling in empty land prevailed, my informants would explain, when prompted, that although there were plenty of natives in Chaco, they hadn't come here before the immigrants generated jobs for them, not here to this colony. When I would ask where the natives who were here in this colony had come from, they would invariably point to other locales, usually further north toward Bolivia or El Impenetrable, often designating this sort of, the El Impenetrable is sort of like the black hole of the nation. I can get more into this in question in the Q&A. So in the capital of the province, I was told that Indians are from the interior. In the largest township of the interior, I was told they'd come from the area surrounding the colony of Castelli. In the colony of Castelli, I was informed once again and at great length that the immigrant ancestors had settled in an empty wasteland, etc., etc. The natives had most certainly never lived here, but had logically come from deeper in the interior, by the rivers. Finally, in the river town itself, none other than the mayor himself confessed to me his frustration that these Indians ask me for so much and pretend like we took their land, even though they really come from the other side of the river, and so on and so forth. I don't have time to go into detail, but sustaining that they'd settled a virgin land was absolutely critical to settler politics of national territorial belonging in very concrete ways, and of course, to settler subjectivities and affects. So to sum up this second section, I'm arguing that the settler society's racial and spatial logic of native estrangement is a critical tool for sustaining the settler narrative of terra nullius, given the obvious phenomenological problem that the disappeared native has by no means disappeared. 3, a tale of two villages. Now for my third point, very quickly, I want to tell you a story that illustrates the impact this logic has had on a particular native slum just outside one of the colonies, the Castelli colony, where the descendants of immigrant invaders insisted that they'd settled an empty land. There are two main native neighborhoods in the vicinity of the colony, both of the same ethnic and linguistic background. Yet one of these was routinely portrayed as more savage, more criminal, more remote, more dangerous, and also, oddly enough, as less authentically Indian than the other. They were also more likely to die of health problems or at the hands of police violence and so forth. When I looked into this contrast ethnographically, through interviews and archives, I found that the logic of native estrangement offered a useful clue to understanding why this particular village was more threatening to the settlers than the other one. What I discovered is that some of the ancestors of the so-called bad Indian village, let's call this Kupi village, were members of the families that had been living precisely on this territory in this particular colony in the past. These original families were removed in order to make room for the settlers in the early 1930s and were sent to a reservation further north that was created for that purpose. They ended up losing reservation status there and thus land title as well. And in the 60s, they began settling back in the area of the colony to meet some basic health and work needs. In 1979, during Argentina's brutal military dictatorship, the local government expelled this group, insisting that they, quote, return to their places of origin. Perhaps not coincidentally, this was also the centennial of the Conquest of the Desert campaign, And on that occasion, the Minister of the Interior publicly praised the campaign for having successfully expelled the foreign Indian who was invading our pampa. So while both native groups were treated as intruders, the treatment was markedly more brutal in the case of the Kupi villagers. They were expelled further outside the colony than the other native village to an area with no water and fewer resources. They were required to purchase this land, and they were forced into military-built huts that made political and social life much more difficult. And today, they're more likely to be victims of police brutality, early death, addiction, and other circumstances, but they're also more likely to stage roadblocks, protests, political radio shows, and so forth. So to summarize my third point, it's precisely the natives who are most from here that were most treated as criminal foreign intruders. So conclusions. I just want to quickly conclude with a note for all of those of us in here who might be interested in understanding and critiquing the relationship between settler colonialism and labor by returning to Patrick Wolf's framework. I want to suggest that Wolf has actually left us with a very useful model for unpacking the tensions at work in any settler society that tries to exploit native labor while also denying native existence. And that's precisely because it points so forcefully to the structural distinction between these two colonial goals, to exploit or eliminate the colonized. I'm suggesting that this contradiction is real, and that any settler society that attempts to do both will have to work really hard to maintain that contradiction intact. Our work as decolonial researchers or activists, then, could be to revisit Wolf's powerful framework in order to unpack the mechanisms of settler ideologies, policies, or discourses that try so hard to maintain this contradiction intact. Again, each settler context will try to resolve this in very particular ways on the ground, and it's important to pay attention to those specific distinctions. In the Argentine cotton belt that I've just discussed with you, it's clear that both land and labor were the goals of settler state incursion, and that the very same natives who were eliminated from the land were also effectively exploited on it. It is also clear that in spite of Argentina's historic reliance on native labor throughout the cash crop and extractive industries, this practice has done very little to alter Argentina's self-image and international reputation as a European immigrant melting pot from which the natives have vanished. The Argentine case also affirms, however, that the colony's reliance on native labor in purportedly virgin land was indeed a problem and a tension that had to be actively reconciled by settler society through specific reservation policies, racialization schemas, and geographical imaginaries. In Argentina and arguably in comparable settler societies elsewhere, from Palestine to South Africa, from North America to South America, the logic of native estrangement arises as an attempted solution to this problem, allowing settlers to posit themselves as native founders of an empty land, while turning the natives into foreign intruders. However, if the logic of estrangement has persisted, this is because settler society has failed to eradicate the native from its midst as a political category. This paper suggests that settler state sovereignty is not a fait accompli, but an ongoing project sustained through political, spatial, and racial technologies of native estrangement. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'll repeat the big thank you to the organizers. Thanks to everyone for coming out, and a big thanks to Dean Sarnillo and Audra Simpson for, so this paper project kind of started off, I got these ideas when I was taking a seminar with each of them about a year ago, and they created really generative spaces to think through some of the problems that settler colonialism has created for the world. So thanks to them. And so this paper is about the category of subsumption in Marx's work and sort of trying to put it in conversation with discussions of indigenous labor and the work of settler colonialism. So, can you guys hear me a little better now? Cool. All right. If I wander too far from this, just snap at me or something. So there's a longer version of this paper where I do some empirical analysis of some struggles over water infrastructure in New Mexico, but for purposes of time, I've cut that stuff out, but I'm happy to discuss that with folks later on. So, in an effort to open up the structures and dynamics of the interplay of coloniality and universality, this paper uses Marx's concepts of subsumption translated from the German subsumption, which is often translated into English as domination. And its two aspects, the formal subsumption of the labor process and the real subsumption of the labor process. In taking up these concepts, they must be stretched and modified to analyze specific aspects of how settler colonial societies are constituted by operations of subsumption in economic and legal registers. Using Marx's concepts in this fashion can help us think through the ways that the capitalist subsumption of the labor process takes place in relation to the settler colonial logics of territorial expansion and elimination of indigenous presence. Finding ways that are subjects and objects of analysis of our studies and of our organizing, so for instance, land, labor, indigenous, proletariat, finding the ways that these things are constituted in relation to each other can bring together critiques of settler colonialism and critiques of capitalism in order to better analyze and theorize the alignments, coalitions, and disjunctures between capitalist and settler colonial processes and formations. Subsumption refers to the logical or ontological process of including or placing a multiplicity of things under a higher, more comprehensive category, or encompassing something as a subordinate or component element, and it has significant resonances with processes of absorption, incorporation, and assimilation. Subsumption implies a hierarchical framework in which specific particulars are gathered under a general universal. The problem in such operations arises when the form of the universal is inadequate to the life of the particular and necessitates the carving down of the particular in order to incorporate it under the universal. The Hegelian concept of the dialectical concrete universal sought to provide an alternative to this problem by conceiving of universality as nothing other than the concrete mediation of particulars which give rise to a dynamic universal instead of an abstracted and subjugated set of things gathered under a dominant universal. In Marx's Capital Volume 1, subsumption is used to describe how the multiplicity of particular labor processes, which can have multiple temporal and value orientations, are absorbed into the capitalist mode of production's labor disciplining with its distinct temporal rhythms and drive to produce surplus value for private accumulation. As mentioned above, Marx's German term subsumption is often translated as domination, which hints at the violence of how the subsumption process takes place. So it's not just a logical or epistemological thing, but it's like a material enforced violence as well. So Marx's writings on subsumption are contained in the appendix to Volume 1 titled Results of the Direct Process of Production, which follows the crucial conclusion to the main body of the book, Part 8, on so-called primitive accumulation. While Marx never explicitly elaborated on the connections between primitive accumulation and subsumption, there appears to be an important resonance between them. Marx concludes Capital Volume 1 by dismissing the idyllic origin stories rehearsed by bourgeois political economists, which narrate a natural, peaceful, and inevitable emergence of the capitalist mode of production. Against these accounts, Marx argues that, quote, in actual history, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, and short force play the greatest part. The history of this expropriation assumes different aspects in different countries and runs through various phases in different orders of succession and at different historical epochs. At this point, Marx is beginning to indicate the ways that primitive accumulation is not simply an origin point after which the capitalist mode of production prevails everywhere and eternally. But despite these glimmering indications, as Glenn Coulthard in Red Skins, White Masks argues, it is necessary to more explicitly theorize primitive accumulation as an ongoing process in light of the persistent, quote, persistent role that unconcealed violent dispossession continues to play in the reproduction of colonial and capitalist social relations in both the domestic and global contexts. Massimiliano Tomba, in his article Accumulation in Time, writes that, quote, the original accumulation, which is another translation of primitive accumulation, the original accumulation is not primitive in the sense of being the starting point of capitalism, but it is instead a whole entirety of always present forms of interventions of economic and extra-economic violence. This understanding of primitive accumulation accords with Coulthard's claim that, quote, settler colonial formations are territorially acquisitive in perpetuity, and Wolff's claim that settler colonizers come to stay, invasion is a structure and not an event, elimination is an organizing principle of a settler colonial society. Subsumption, as Marx describes it, is an ongoing historical process of logical, legal, and political violence through which the capitalist mode of production expands itself spatially and installs itself temporally. In Marx's analysis, the study of subsumption focuses on how multiple different labor processes are incorporated into a universal labor process that produces surplus value for capitalist appropriation. Although Wolff is correct in noting, with reference to 19th century removal policy, that native agricultural productivity is not simply incorporated into the colonial economy, some of the quote-unquote positive assimilationist dimensions of the logic of elimination that are developed during the late 19th century can arguably be thought of in Marxist terms as the subsumption of indigenous labor. Elsewhere, Wolff writes that, quote, capitalist colonization is a primarily economic articulation through which economic aspects of indigenous life are either replaced or reconstituted in accordance with the overriding requirements of capitalism, and in ways that are not that different from what Marx is writing about under the category of subsumption. Marx, in his theory, distinguishes between two aspects of subsumption. The first is the formal subsumption of the labor process, in which capitalists intervene into and take ownership of an already existing labor process from a non-capitalist mode of production. In this aspect, quote, the production processes of various social provenance have been transformed into capitalist production, and the mystification inherent in the capital relation attempts to make labor appear to be naturally dependent on capital. In actual fact, the capital relation is dependent on the continual reproduction of this condition through economic and extra-economic violence. And the disciplinary methods deployed in the formal aspect of subsumption of an already existing labor process include the forcible extension of the working day, the public and private plunder, and commodification of the means of subsistence and the surpluses that are produced in indigenous labor systems. And along with these other disciplinary methods, there's also credit relations established by governmental agencies and private lenders, which is something I was looking at in the longer version of the paper, but if folks have questions about that, I can get into that in the Q&A. So these capitalist and colonialist relations are historically contingent and produced through force. They're not natural, inevitable, and eternal features of the world. The range of activities legislated and prescribed under U.S. Indian policy provide many examples through which we can study how subsumption operates. U.S. colonization has taken place not only through violent territorial theft and dispossession, but also through forms of training and discipline geared to subsume the labor process of indigenous farmers and other forms of indigenous labor. Before colonization, and during the course of ongoing resistance to the colonial enforcement of the capital relation, indigenous farmers work at a temporal rhythm determined by themselves based on their assessment of the needs of their selves, communities, and nations. The combined forces of colonial and capital relations work to subsume the labor process of indigenous farmers as their means of production are stolen and their labor process is increasingly subjected to the demands of a temporal rhythm dictated by capital through wage relations and commodification. Formal subsumption is in effect when capitalist economic relations dictate the tempo of labor in order to produce surplus value for private appropriation. And formal subsumption of labor is most apparent, and this is a quote from Marx, where, in consequence, capital has not yet succeeded in becoming the dominant force, capable of determining the form of society as a whole. Marx goes on to describe the second aspect of subsumption, real subsumption, as a situation in which, quote, the capitalist must be the owner and proprietor of the means of production on a social scale, and social here is in italics, thereby being able to use technical and industrial means of reorganizing the production of society entirely in the image of capital. The implication is that capital has achieved a certain degree of transformation of the world such that the labor process and mode of production are qualitatively different than pre- and or non-capitalist labor processes and modes of production. But in considering the limits of this implication, I think this implication runs into the same problems that, that Marx's sort of primitive accumulation as a stage and not a sort of process runs into. So in considering the limits of this implication, it is useful to bring together Coulthard's and Thoma's interpretations of primitive accumulation as a reiterative process to think about a continual tarrying between formal and real aspects of subsumption, instead of thinking of them as successive linear stages in which formal subsumption gives rise to real subsumption and then remains firmly in the past. Doing so allows us to think about Alyosha Goldstein's point that, quote, settler colonialism in the United States is a perpetually incomplete project. Given this perpetual incompleteness, it may be useful to think about how subsumption operates through a temporal dimension that anachronizes non-capitalist indigenous temporalities while synchronizing non-capitalist indigenous labor processes to the capitalist mode of production. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all? Yes. All right, perfect. So first off, I do want to thank the organizers for having me and also for my fellow panelists. I'm glad to be going last. But when I say that, I'm glad to be going last because I still know that there's many more panels in the roundtable to go. It's only the beginning of the day. So thankfully, when Anne pointed out that we need to acknowledge, but also be reflective of the space we're occupying today, Manahata. But what I also want to point to is something very interesting. If we think back and we are truly reflective of our practices, why do we call, let's say, New York a state and not a colony? When does the transition occur between the 13 original colonies and statehood? In particular, when you had, the common reading is, once you have the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, then a new process was formed. And in the words of Hannah Arendt, in the liberatory process of revolution, what you have is the constituting of freedom. So you create a new public, or in her reading, a republic. So previously you had 13 original colonies, and in these colonies, they were colonial under Arendtian reading simply because of their relationship with England. But as we all know, and I'm sure we're familiar with from these talks previously and from our own private readings, that doesn't really describe the American, or specifically in my reading, the US relations. That there's more going on to describe the colonialism of the United States. And it's very interesting that there is not a lot of scholarship done describing the United States as a post-colony, or even, if you would probably a better characterization, a neo-colonial adventure. And I think we need to be more reflective of how these practices institute our whole Republican, or even now today, democratic traditions. Now, with that being said, I looked through Hannah Arendt's work, specifically her work, her classic On Revolution, to see, well, how am I going to categorize revolutionary practices, and how do they relate to this transition from colonies or colonialism in one tradition to statehood? Now, the work of Carol Pateman in The Settler Contract, or Charles Mills in The Domination Contract, try to use this social contract theory to see how this ideal that was put out in the world really has some racialized or colonial context, and even with the sexual contract, there's many different layers. Now, I know in this room it's not hard if I was just to stipulate, hey, let's think of the United States as a settler colony. I don't think I'd get that much pushback. But for these purposes, especially for the purposes of my paper, since I come from a philosophical tradition where this is unexamined, you have to make the argument. So the reason why I chose Hannah Arendt are because I see certain Eurocentric blindnesses, but also some benefits of her model. In particular, she talks about a space of appearance. Now, a space of appearance is when men get together and interact, and they respect through word and deeds their actions. And I need to stipulate that it's under her model, they force equality. Men are not, there's no natural rights theory born into it, and that it has to be a plurality of different people. That if you have this model, if you have this room, for instance, if we all came together and you respected our words and you heard us and listened to us and found my words meaningful, then what we're instituting is a space of appearance. That me being able to appear to you and you appearing to me, this is a political space, and the main reason this space is instituted is for freedom. That I may do something unexpected and that you never even thought of, or even this panel might have done something unexpected, or this whole process will institute something very unexpected. And for Arendt, that's very important because that's what politics should be about, freedom, and her term is natality. Now, if you use this model of a space of appearance, Arendt actually maps this on to the US Republic. That when they created the Constitution and had this new document and this revolutionary practice, that they instituted something brand new, and what they instituted was political freedom. Now, with this being said, again, put aside our thoughts on the US as a settler colonial, let's just examine her words. Did the US actually institute a political space of freedom? Now, under my reading, I agree. I agree that it created freedom for certain people, namely white property-owning settlers. I definitely agree that, yes, this did happen. And her example is the Mayflower Compact. So Englishmen, specifically Puritans, in avoiding religious persecution, traveled, booked the ship, the Mayflower, traveled on the ship, and before they reached what today we call the United States or Massachusetts, before they reached the land, they all came together and made a compact or a promise to one another. They instituted a space of appearance in a political realm where they would be respected, they would be equals, they would have certain differences, but wherever they would go, they would create, in a sense, you can use the term civilization or a city. And for Arendt, she goes back in time to say, oh, this is the Greek solution. Or in my manner, it's a Greek mode of colonization. And the word she uses that always I pay particular attention to is, wherever you go, you will be a polis. Now, if we take the Mayflower Compact, for example, wherever the Puritans eventually landed, we now know Plymouth Rock, but wherever they had landed, they would have instituted a polis. They would have instituted a space of appearance that would give them political freedom. However, we know the problem, especially when we're talking about settler colonialism or even imperial colonialism, that, hey, if you have this word earth, and earth is, I don't know, occupied, what happens if you have this model of a space of appearance and Greek colonization? Well, yes, wherever you go, you can create freedom for yourself or for this group. Like if we all of a sudden decided to jump up and occupy Wendy's because I passed it, I don't know, I can't think of any, I think I saw a Chase as well, but if we decided to go and occupy those places, we would institute a space of appearance, but what happens when those spaces are occupied? Now, it would seem that you would come into conflict, that you couldn't really have freedom necessitated on the unfreedom of others. But what Arendt says, and I think with a lot of European intellectual projects or specifically modes of justification and legitimacy for the United States is, well, okay, yes, we did, in a sense, move over and settle the New World, but it was unoccupied, or they didn't build, like you have so many justifications. They didn't really have farming practices, they didn't have fences, they didn't believe in private property. But in a sense, I know a panelist spoke before, this is terra nullius. And it's a Latin term that means, in a sense, empty land. That what justifies under the Arendtian model and a lot of social contracts is the idea that when Europeans came to the new land, it was emptied already. Or, in a sense, the population wasn't a significant amount. But Arendt even goes a step further and acknowledges, no, that indigenous people did occupy that land, but their elimination was due to frontiersmen. It was solely due to the violence in the borderlands. However, what I want to argue is that this is an incorrect view. One, that's the easy saying, but it's an incorrect model because it's not that we had indigenous people on these frontiers, on these borderlands, and then we had certain transgressors or very violent Europeans going to murder them. Murder did occur, genocide did occur, but what instituted this relationship was that Mayflower Compact, was that Greek colonization that came to the new land. So it's not in a sense that the land was empty. What Arendt doesn't acknowledge, and a lot of our European research doesn't acknowledge, is the relationships between the frontier and the public, or the frontier and colonies. Now, Arendt wants to say that the US Republic was so new, so revolutionary for the fact that it created a space of appearance for European settlers. However, this space could only be necessitated or created or founded by, first off, emptying the land, creating it as terra nullius, and then when you had conflict with indigenous people still being there, you now called it the frontier. And within the frontier, violence is applicable because it's outside the polis, it's outside the city or republic. So under this model, I wanted to explore further that, okay, terra nullius is a very important concept to legitimate the US Republic. But now what happens if this is an ongoing, I know the panelists said it very wonderfully, quoting Wolf and Cotard. Now what if we think of settler colonialism as a structure that is territorially acquisitive in perpetuity? What happens if that you need a terra nullius to get you the land, but then you need to realize that you need to keep the land, or you need to keep making frontiers to get control of that land? So for me in my research, even though Arendt wants to have, in a sense, a ship or a boat or the Mayflower be her mode of politics, that you need to account for the ways that even the space of appearance is necessitated upon the control of territory. Now, if we were to think of a modern example of this, if you think about Occupy Oregon that happened earlier this year, 40-day occupation with the Bundy militia, that they wanted to argue, hey, we have a certain, again, let's go back, the Constitution affords equal rights to all. So why don't we have access to that land? Why can't we why can't we let our cattle graze that land? So the main issue here is between the federal government and what they call the sovereign citizen movement. The Bundy militia wanted equal rights under our model of the Constitution. The federal government stipulated that they have certain control of land, but what was erased in here? In an ignoring or erasure of the Burns-Paiute claim to that land. Like, it was occurring on land already taken. It used to be a reservation, but now it's a wildlife refuge. So what you really have at issue between the Bundy militia and the federal government is a settler logic. Who controls the land? Who has access to the land? While acknowledging that it's definitely not indigenous people. And even Lavoy Finicum, I believe that's how you pronounce his last name, the one fatality, and I actually smirked when I found out he was the one fatality because he had a video being released urging indigenous people to say, well, the federal government hasn't done anything for you. We're actually fighting for you, so the indigenous people should support our occupation. So I was not that sad when he died, even though I respect life and dignity for all. But again, when you live in a settler colonial republic, I'm not that sympathetic to settlers. Even stipulate that my family immigrated to the United States, and there's also settler logic in occupying land unless you acknowledge its indigenous territory. It's even, in certain cases, unceded territory. So I do want to stipulate that in some instances I'm a settler, so I don't like myself at times. But even though I'm running short on time, what I do want to mention are that, okay, you have this model of a space of appearance that's problematic because it allows settler colonialism. So what I stipulated this as was, I called it wretched spaces, taking inspiration from Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon, his view of imperial colonialism is that it creates Manichean spaces. And this division is between the native city and the European city. And again, if we think of it in terms of the frontier and the Arendtian polis, that under Fanon's reading, these two worlds can never meet. That what you really need, in a sense, is a revolution to upend the system and to upend this colonial relationship. Now, on the Arendtian model, however, she believes, that there can be no such thing as holes of oblivion. That there can be, even in her own work, if she erases indigenous people, that they still exist. And under this model, if you still like of a space of appearance, if you like that we created a room where we could be free and new things could appear and we could have a conversation, which I like that model, how do we get rid of settler colonialism, or how do we get rid of the connection it has with territorialism. Well, one way is to look at how she believes, unlike Fanon, that reconciliation is possible. Because for her, domination, extractivism, resource extractions, this is still contested. We still have indigenous land-based decolonization practices on the issue of land. So it's not like a totalitarian regime or bureaucracy where you're just governing from afar and you have no relationships with the people. Bundy, the federal government, and the Burns Paiute, they were in conversation, even in conflict with one another. Now, with this being said, I do want to point out that another aspect of my paper, I know we're running short on time, was to, again, now look at other, as we say, states. But I want to look at other colonies. So one of the colonies I looked at was Hawaii, and specifically in the Kaena Point region, there's what's going on is a contestation between what's called conservation. So even though our work and the future work of the panels will deal with the labor relationships and the work of settler colonialism, I see settler logic even in benign aspects as land conservation, because again, land is the most important part of settler colonialism, so land management also has violent aspects. And in the Hawaii example, they call it fortress conservation, because to prevent or to protect environmental concerns, in Hawaii, the Department of Land and Natural Resources was very willing to ignore Native Hawaiian claims to that land, and specifically their relationship to land. So what I really want to say at the outset is, let's think of different relationships towards lands that aren't colonial. So thank you.
Okay, well, we're figuring out how to get these aisle mics ready. So if you have questions for the panel here, we're going to open up for 15 minutes of question and answer. So if you can just come down and line up at these two mics on the sides. Once we just stand. Okay, interesting. Maybe we'll pull down. Okay, so we'll make sure that we're repeating the question into the, so that means also that when you're asking the questions, please keep the questions short and succinct and as actual questions, if possible. Yeah, we can maybe share one of the mics, pull it down, let's do that instead. And if possible, if you can address the person on the panel you'd like to address the question to, that'll also help us with the question and answer. So yeah, let's go here first.
Good morning. I'm Marian Douglas Ungaro from Washington, D.C., and my husband, Carlo Ungaro, from D.C. and Rome, Italy. And actually, my comment is more directed toward Mr. Miranda. And I think when you made your comment about being a settler yourself, that it actually needs qualification. Because I think some people here may have thought that you said that as a black person, and some people here, because I'm under the impression, I saw your name, is your family from someplace outside the U.S.?
Hello? That's on.
It's on.
So yes, my family is from Cape Verde, so on the west coast of Africa. I'm first generation born.
Okay, well, thank you for saying that, because that's extremely important. I say that as a black American. And yesterday I observed the 166th birthday or anniversary of my great-great-grandmother's birthday in North Carolina. And later this year will be the 107th anniversary of my great-great-grandfather's. He was enslaved and she was Scots-Irish. And they could not be married because white people couldn't marry either Native Americans or blacks. But excuse me for being a little bit unclear on this. However, the presence of the Afro-descendant people and also our relationship to the indigenous people, the colonization is not just of the land, but it's physically of us and our identities. So that even when you just made that statement, but you didn't clarify that you were saying that as somebody whose family is from Cabo Verde, not as a black person, because there are black people who are from here. And we also are tied to the Native Americans too. There are people that you encounter in what's considered indigenous space who are obviously of African descent, and those of us who are in the space that's assigned to the black people, which also the white folks dictate this too, you can and sometimes can and often cannot tell, because we're not supposed to exist, the people who are black and Indian. So I think that that needs to be discussed further. Also, in terms of genocide, this year is the 65th anniversary of Black Americans taking a document to the United Nations called We Charge Genocide. And I would really look forward to help from people in this room who care about these issues, because that document has never yet been recognized. The United Nations has never recognized that they received the document. Paul Robeson and a delegation took that. And so the enslavement applies to, of course, indigenous people and the Afro-descendants together, and the genocide also applies to both of us, because besides the black labor issue is our presence, our existence, and that is not just being challenged, but we can see in the news that we're basically being removed. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for your comment. And first off, I want to apologize for not clarifying beforehand. So one thing I do want to point out, that I do take the words of Sylvia Wynter seriously and her thoughts on indigeneity. So yes, when I said I'm a settler in some aspects, I didn't want to, again, foreclose the experience like, oh, as a black man, I'm stipulating this. But I do think in terms of indigeneity that when you, in a sense, indigenize the land, yes, we have slaves coming over from Africa, and they have a relationship, a long history that I don't want to erase in the Americas, that they are part of America, so calling that settler, in a sense, would also be wrong. But also, I'd want to point out that even with, because again, with relationships between African Americans and Native Americans, there are some, again, there are some meeting points, but also some dissimilarities. So if in advocating for black rights, you don't take seriously indigenous rights, then at times you can be a settler even as an African American, but that can be for further discussion, but yeah, there's also other relationships. Yeah, I'm not talking about my family relationship. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm perfectly fine with that. And just to the last part, when you brought up the We Charge Genocide, I do want to stipulate that my paper dealt with wretched spaces only in the context of frontiers and what I call the naturalization of indigenous bodies, and not bodies, people, sorry. But the other aspect of another paper I'm exploring is the internal wretched spaces created by the US Republic with regards to African Americans in slavery. So thank you again for your comments.
Thank you. Let's go over here.
Hi, I have a question for Tamar. So I think this actually might illustrate the previous question, and I'm curious about if you can go back to the 19th century in Argentina, the particular case of Argentina and the Conquista del Desierto, as you're trying to trace, because it is in large part the forced conscription of the black population of Argentina that is the fighting force that then, to the service of the state, eliminates, right, wins the desert, right, as it's called in the 19th century in Argentina. So I wonder if you can actually put into dialogue this black erasure and at the same time, right? So what is that relationship in your work? Like you're more focused, I think, on the contemporary period, but I think it's also really important to talk about the black population of Argentina from the 18th century to now more resurgent Afro-Argentine voices that are trying to reclaim that. So I think that that's actually a point that might illustrate just what we were talking about.
Someone pass a mic down to Tamar so she can respond.
Thank you so much for that question. This is actually a point I've been struggling with in my research. And I think that I have intuitive answers for it. I don't yet have concrete answers that I'm satisfied with. But there certainly are parallels between the logics, the attempted logics of erasure in Argentina that have attempted to deny the existence of Afro-Argentines and natives alike. One of the ways I think it could be interesting to look at the mechanisms of this erasure and sort of like tie the two issues together is through the how the figure of the Creole, the criollo, has been constructed in Argentina. I mentioned in my paper the term cabecita negra, which literally means little blackhead, and in general, there's been, and I think this is very much part of, as you're suggesting, this is part of the settler logic at work in Argentina, to take to separate out different categories of to racialize different categories of people, to take indigenous people or people who look like they might have native ancestry and place them all into a racialized class distinction is always already considered as lower than those of white European settler descent. And to mix sort of ambiguously any sort of origin that is separate from the white settler origin. So in the term cabecita negra, you have a lot of ambiguity. What is this blackness in the little blackhead term? And there's just started to be, there's a very new literature on this problem in Argentina. But I guess what I want to stress is that I think there's a sort of there is an important ideological function at work in the ambiguity of this racialized reference to blackness in this term, which somehow refers to people of native descent and totally deterritorializes and depoliticizes that identity, and also does the same to Afro-Argentine ancestry, and sort of mixes it into this convenient otherness that has no land claim, and that is a sort of exploitable laboring mass. As soon as they're not working as the exploitable laboring mass, they become a problem. Whether it's an Indian problem or a black, they become a problem. They become the throngs of occupiers, of squatters. There are people who are not supposed to be there as soon as they shift out of that role as the racialized working class. So that's sort of like my incipient answer to your question, but I would love to talk about that further. Thank you.
Can you come up to one of the mics? Okay, Andrew's gonna, because there are people on live stream and they're trying to watch online, we wanna make sure that we get the mics to people, so Andrew's walking it over.
All right, thank you very much for your stimulating papers. I, as a young man, was in Southern Africa in the late 70s and covered the liberation wars, particularly in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. So what I was struck with in listening to your discussions was the question, two questions. First of all, the look at non-European settler colonialism, because what comes into mind when I listen to this is the whole concept in the 19th century of the Mithakani of the Zulu, the expansion of the Zulu in Southern Africa, which was, in a sense, you know, one could use different, perhaps, ways of theoretically looking at a settler colonialism, but was an expansion of power, and it raises questions about in looking at this and thinking about this, how does that factor in? How do you think about this? Secondly, with the United States, it seems to me that there's a rich, rich historical dialogue going back decades on the questions that you raise. That is, what kind of models of settler colonialism, the overlappingness of it, do we get in terms of the traditions? That is, from the English with the expansion into Wales, expansion into Scotland, and there's work on Ireland, how these kind of models are transposed to the United States. And there's an old historical scholarship in the 19th century about the company set up in the coastline of the Atlantics in the 16th and 17th century. And I'm wondering how you all are seeing this kind of scholarship in perhaps deepening or enriching how one looks at these kind of questions.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to?
Thank you for your two questions. So if I can just categorize them, the first question was on non-European forms of perhaps settler colonialism. And the second was on how do previous models, such as with the England and Ireland, how can it impact our work?
Let's get to the answer.
Yeah. Okay. So to the first question with the expansion of Zulu, I do agree that there are non-European forms of settler colonialism, but when you get more to the modern day, like if you think of the example of Imperial Japan, would you describe that as enacting settler colonialism, or again, do you think there's a difference between settler colonialism and imperialism? And there's a lot of literature combating how similar the two facets are. And for me, just off the bat, if the two are both interested in specifically a relationship to land, I think under my space of appearance or the Arendtian model, I think there could be significant overlap because I don't want to just limit it to European forms of settler colonialism, but just settler colonialism wherever it appears, because we still, if we're taking Annabelle Quijano seriously, we live in a globalized modernity of coloniality. So.
Thank you. We're going to take a really quick 5-minute bathroom break. Or do you have a question? No. Can you hold it for the next? Yeah, okay. You'll still be here, right? Okay, so 5 minutes, and then we'll get started on the next panel.